I'm really blessed that Kristine said yes to this event, and also want to just do another shout out to Lori for this beautiful space, this writer's ecosystem that she's created over many years that's nurtured me, that's nurtured all of us. She so generously gave this space, so I'm just grateful. Yes, all around. So I'm gonna, Kristine and I met at a writing program in Andros in Greece, a place that nurtured both of our books. We met in a workshop room. It's a writing program called Aegean Arts Circle. It's run by a friend of ours, Amalia Melis. And it's a special place where, our vulnerable selves were nurtured. And so I'm so honored that you're here today, and so honored to have met you in that delicate place where you were, getting the bravery together to voice your story, as was I. So I think what I want to do first is just read a little bit of a description of the book, in case not everyone has had a chance to look at it, and just to ground ourselves in what the story is. And then Kristine will do a reading, and we'll just kind of start our conversation.
You guys hear back here? Yeah. Okay, great.
Good, because I can yell. Kristine S. Ervin was just 8 years old when her mother, Kathy Sue Engel, was abducted from an Oklahoma mall parking lot and violently murdered in an oil field. First there was grief, then the desire to know what happened to her, what she felt in her last terrible moments, and all she was before these acts of violence defined her life. In her mother's absence, Ervin tries to reconstruct a woman she can never fully grasp. From her own memory, from letters she uncovers, and from the stories of other family members. As more information about her mother's death comes to light, Ervin's drive to know her mother only intensifies, winding into her own fraught adolescence. She reckons with contradictions of what a woman is allowed to be, a self beyond the roles of wife, mother, daughter, victim. What a true, quote unquote, true victim is supposed to look like. And finally, how complicated and elusive justice can be. Told fearlessly and poetically, Rabbit Heart weaves together themes of power, gender, and justice into a manifesto of grief and reclamation. Our stories do not need to be simple to be true, and there is power in the telling. Kristine S. Ervin is a creative writing instructor at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. She holds a MFA from NYU, a PhD from the University of Houston, and I'm so pleased to welcome her here with us today.
Thank you, Leslie and Lori and everyone who is here. I mean, this is an incredible space and incredible company. I just feel grateful and I feel so very honored. So I have so much gratitude in me. I don't know how to contain it. And a wonderful introduction. And yes, the meeting that we had on the island of Andros, there were moments when I was working on difficult subjects and reading my work out loud, and I would look over at Leslie and just feel a connection and feel that this is somebody who heard my story, who could give me feedback on my story, who could push me in directions that I didn't anticipate being pushed with my work. And I will never forget sitting across the table from you in that sacred space and feeling that connection. So I'm just feel so much love and gratitude for you to be here. Yes, everyone. So difficult subject matter. It is a book that is not about rabbits. Normally I would read the section that explains the title, but I'm going to focus on a different section instead because of the conversation that I think will emerge in this space. But to just give you the explanation behind the title, My mother was abducted from the shopping mall, and her body was found about a week later. It took some time to identify the body. I went to my father sometime after her death, and I was 8 years old, and I snuggled up against him on the couch, and I asked him how she died. And I was really asking not so much about the men. I didn't know that men kidnapped my mother. That was the word I had then. But I wanted the cause of death. I was curious about that. And my father took the approach that he would not lie to his children. And so he was honest and he was direct. And he said, the police don't know. And I asked him why. And he said, because her body had been exposed to elements and had begun to decompose. And I didn't fully understand that at 8 years old. But I did know that a body would become bones. And so I asked how the police knew it was her, because I was holding on to this wish that she was still out there, because I never saw the body. I never had that form of closure. And he said that they identified her through her dental records. And I snuggled a little bit more closely to him, and I asked him, how do you think she died? And he told me the story. He said, I hope she died like a bunny rabbit would. And he started explaining that bunny rabbits, when they're being pursued by a predator, they can get so scared that their hearts stop pumping before anything happens to them. So that was the version that I had of my mother's death until my coming of age, and the evidence destroyed that version. So part of Rabbit Heart is tracing that movement from that not fully innocent, but more innocent death to what I know now. And also what I know now as a woman, having experienced gender violence and patriarchy. So that is the source of the title, this beautiful gift that my father offered me when I was 8 years old, the softness of that gift. And so again, rabbit is metaphor for the mother. And the rabbit shows up multiple times in the memoir as the versions of my mother's death become revised over time. But what I figured I would start off with in the opening chapter, which is titled Woman Gone Missing, I speak about the wonderful offering my father gave to me and my brother, that if we wanted the car back, my mother's car, he would bring it back to the house after the FBI processed it. And we said no, but it was a remarkable gift that he was willing to give us if we needed it. And then right after that, I have this scene. So I figured I would read from this. If you have a copy of the book and you enjoy following along, we were just bonding over some hearing loss, and I tend to like to follow along for that reason. I also have feathers tucked away in my books. So you're going to see me pull feathers out from time to time. So this is going to be the second vignette in the opening chapter, and I'll read it and then we'll have our conversation. Yeah? I have not performed this piece, so good luck to me. Especially with the camera on, I didn't make a wise choice there. My niece Kenzie and I lay in my father's bed, off-white comforter covering our toes, her on the left where my mother once slept, me on the right, my father's side. We were watching Bambi, her first time, though she knew a few lines from the commercial for the newly released DVD. Lines like, "Hurry, the new prince is born," and "Man was in the forest." She curled her body, small at 4 years old, beside me, placing her arm across my stomach, her head to my chest. I wondered if my mother and I had been like this, if she had placed her hand on the top of my head as the doe keeps twitching her ears, sensing what's in the distance. I was 27 when Kenzie and I watched this, me living in Houston with my husband Jerry and working on my PhD. Kenzie kept asking why I wouldn't stay in Oklahoma, where every day could be a day for movies and making chocolate chip cookies, eating spoonfuls of dough as they baked. "You can't go back to Houston," she said. "There are lions and tigers at your house." I didn't know how to explain that after living in New York and then in Houston, I could never return to Oklahoma, even as much as I missed her and Dad and thunderstorms. I didn't know how to say there are tigers in Oklahoma too, some of them living next door. The objects in my father's room, A cedar chest, a macrame planter that hung from the ceiling and held nothing, a crystal box in the shape of a shell were mostly the same as when Mom was alive, though Dad didn't keep up with the house the way that she would have. Strips of olive green wallpaper, its adhesive deteriorating, were falling, little by little, so that they looked like the peels of half-eaten bananas. I kept thinking, how can Dad sleep like this, where above your head wallpaper seeks to smother you micromillimeters at a time? When Bambi and his mother walk in the meadow, desolate in winter except for a single patch of April grass, I said to Kenzie, "There's a sad part coming up." And she, hearing the music grow more ominous, held on to me more tightly. My brother had felt uneasy about our watching the movie, worrying about the mother's death. "But you let her watch Lion King," I said, where a lion murders his brother, and Snow White, where a man tries to stab Snow White and the witch tries to poison her, and then there's Finding Nemo, where the mother dies in the first minute of the movie. "Yeah, but there's something about Bambi that's worse," he said. Kenzie pressed her body even closer, the mother sensing danger and frantically scanning the empty field. We were watching and listening to her panic, her yelling for Bambi not to look back as they ran. I didn't hear my mother then. But then Bambi's in the thicket, snow descending thick and heavy. He's calling out, "Mother," calling out, "Where are you?" calling out, "Mother" again. He's running through the forest, ears flat and back. I know that desperation, and know he'll forever be looking. Kenzie, her body so small next to mine, asked, "Is she dead? Did the mommy die?" "Yes, Goose, the mommy died," I answered, looking over at the chest, my mother's picture lying face down, dust thick like fur. Years ago, the glass cracked, and Dad had planned to replace it. Had it been upright, Kenzie would have seen her grandmother, wearing pearls and a cream sweater with shoulder pads, her hair nearly black into her shoulders, her eyes looking to her right. It's the photograph the police used and displayed on the afternoon and evening news, back when they were searching still. "But what happened?" Kenzie asked. "She was shot by man," I said. Bambi staring up at his father, so tall, so stoic in the snow. I hear my own father say, "Your mother cannot be with you anymore." I see my own head go down. "Is the daddy going to take care of him?" she asked. "Yes, the daddy will take care of him." I kissed Kenzie's forehead. But I didn't say, as perhaps I should have, "The forest is all around you. The meadow isn't a meadow, but a parking lot, a closet, a bed." Or the front yard, where your neighbor watches you lay out in the sun, ice in your lemonade melting. I didn't tell her that sometimes you seek the meadow precisely because man is there, though you aren't sure why. Maybe it's because you've been taught he has exactly what you need, that he's the one who planted the spring grass when you're hungry and thin. Or maybe it's because the meadow is where your mother has been, and you'll do anything it takes to feel close to her again.
Thank you. It's so moving to me, and to hear you speak it with such, vulnerable emotionality is so powerful. And, it brings me to this place of when I was reading your book, it often is seen as sort of true crime and that sort of takes over. But for me, just as what you read, it was really a motherless daughter story. Yeah. And that's what it is for me. It's, it's about what it's like to go through your life without your mother and to lose your mother as a child. And there's been, wonderful, writings and research done. Hope Edelman wrote Motherless Daughters. I know we both read that. Yep. When we were young women, and it's a certain kind of journey to have to shoulder your life without the person who should be exempling and teaching you. Yeah. And we have to teach ourselves, right? And we feel abandoned in that place. And I know for myself, I lost my mother to breast cancer when I was in high school. And so I often couldn't see a life beyond what happened to her. Her disease, her shortened life, that would be mine. I couldn't, we blur her life and ours. And it took me a while to separate this out. What was it like for you? Did you feel really identified with your mother, and how did you hold her throughout your life?
It's interesting, that question, how did you hold her? Because my first response, my response is that I didn't hold her, and I wanted to. There was always this intense longing for the mother, and to hold her, to feel connected to her, to find her. One of the early chapters in Rabbit Heart is my essentially looking for her in different spaces. I was 8 years old, so I didn't really get to know who my mother was as a woman. I didn't get to know the things that she valued, the spaces that she loved. Leslie, even you, I know that if something were to happen to you and I wanted to feel connected to you, I would go swim in the bay.
Right.
I know that.
And we did.
And we did. You went a bit farther than I did. But growing up, it was, what spaces did my mother love? And I would ask my father, and I wouldn't get any answers. He didn't know. So I felt like I didn't hold her. I wanted to. And it became this searching, searching for her in different spaces, being afraid of other spaces, being afraid to return to the mall, for example. Certainly feeling her when I returned to the mall when I was in college for a job interview, and walked that parking lot and felt terror. There was a connection there. I imagined her abduction, I imagined her rape, I imagined her murder, all different forms, all of them terrible. And that was a longing and a way to connect and understand. And one of the big questions in Rabbit Heart, which is a difficult question, a scary question for me to put out into the world, is how much did I want violence against my own body at the hands of men as a way to feel connected to my mother? It's a question that really can't be answered, but it's an important question to have. And so it wasn't that in the moment when I was experiencing violence did I feel connected to her, but later when reflecting on that violence and building the connections and thinking of those threads, that I did come to see, a form of holding her in a way that I don't recommend. It's a traumatic type of holding. And I think now that's changed, though. I'm removed from that younger self. And I've had moments with my niece, for example, decorating Christmas ornaments when she was young. And I felt my mother in those moments with paint on my fingertips, because we used to decorate Christmas ornaments together, or making the chocolate chip cookies. I've had some moments like that of connection where I feel I can hold her. But that happened later in my life than it did in my adolescence. Adolescence was so defined by thoughts of violence and by violence against my body, and by, being in the company of men. I mean, this space is amazing to me because of all the women who are here. I didn't come to appreciate women until much later in my life. So I was surrounded by men growing up and being squeezed from all different angles, honestly. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I answered the question okay.
Yeah, you did. And I feel like it resonates for me because motherless daughters, usually we have to create our mother.
Yeah.
And we have to create the connection, and we have to keep building that relationship over time. And that's what you're sharing. You sort of kept building your relationship and creating it with your mother sometimes through this portal of sexual assault.
Yeah.
And, I know myself when I go, my mother died of breast cancer, I felt that specter over me. When I go in for scans, I feel close to her. I no longer feel like it's my inevitability, but I do feel like scans are a place where I feel her, where she visits me, And so I think that's so honest and beautiful for you to talk about this, grave, this trespass, this rape, sexual assault that you experienced, that your mother experienced. And there is this shocking, beautiful way that it's I don't know, it illuminates your mother and you together. But that's just one place in the journey, in the evolution, right? This book is also such a deep feminist book, where you take on the patriarchy, you take on all the everyday assaults of violence that are all around us, the ordinary ways that we are violated as women in the society. And you take that on and you call that out, and even when it surfaces in your own father,
Yes.
when you're sharing with him, this happened to me, the neighbor did this to me, and your father, or the doctor did this to me, the teacher did this to me, and your father sort of downplayed it,
Yes.
right? And what was that like for you when he suddenly, was that shocking in the moment? Like, he's going to have my back, right? I'm telling him, I'm crying, I'm telling him how I was violated. And he kind of doesn't get it.
Yeah. May I pause before answering that and read from your memoir?
Sure.
So I'm going to
I
go
knew
back.
you were going to do this.
I'm going to just go back to what you were saying previously in terms of the connection that you feel with your mother when you're going in for screenings, because you have this amazing moment in your memoir. If you don't mind, and if this is too much, Leslie, then you can shut me up. But thinking about when your mother dies, and this is page 48, if anybody has the book in front of you. But you say there would be no more hospital visits, no more talks at the kitchen table or in the car after chemo appointments. 1,000 unspeakable words rose up in my throat, words I couldn't yet reach, words I would spend the rest of my life forming and unforming. And I just think that resonates with what you were talking about in terms of, when you go to these scans and you feel your mother in this way, that's part of the unspeakable. That's part of the forming and unforming and the continued dialogue. And it's not as we wish it to be, but it's what we have. And this moment resonated for me.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
As did other moments when you have with your father. And so with my father, to answer your question, when I went to my father as an adolescent and said, Doctor, what did I name him in the memoir? I had to change his name. I swapped out abusers, by the way. So it was a nice little trick. I needed to change names. But, so you just kind of take that name over there that and that name over there, different circumstance. So Dr. Walcott, as he's named in the book, when I started being a teenager and going to my family doctor, he's the one who delivered me. He's my family doctor. He would keep asking me about kissing boys. Do I like kissing boys? And it was making me uncomfortable. And I went to my father and I said, he's making me uncomfortable. And he said, oh, he's just joking with you. And then there was a time I went in and I was in high school and there was a thermometer. I'd taken my temperature. I set it on the table in front of my legs. And when he came in, he said, is that an in-between-the-legs thermometer? And I went to my father with this. He said, well, isn't there always a nurse in the room with you? And I said, no. He said, oh, well, that's why I thought he was joking with you. And I said, what am I supposed to do with this? He said, well, you could just go see another doctor. Well, to an adolescent girl, I was thinking, well, if he sees me in the practice and I'm going to another doctor, then Dr. Walcott's going to ask me why I'm going to another doctor, and then I'm going to have to explain. And you start doing this spiraling, right? And this protection of the man. And so in the moment, no, there was no, my father's not protecting me. There was no, there should be another answer here because I was a child. And this is my parent, and I'm listening to my parent. It's only later in womanhood, looking back, that I think, oh, this is all problematic. And all these moments that I had, my neighbors, for example, as an adolescent, I thought I had agency. I thought I was mature. I thought I put on a performance of an adult woman, even though I was a 17-year-old. And then later I find out that no, these neighbors considered me to be vulnerable. That was the word that they used. So then you start reframing it. Recalibration was the word we used the other day. So it's then in womanhood and adulthood when I went to my father and Rabbit Heart was getting closer to happening, and I had a conversation about my experiences with the neighbors. And he essentially did what the patriarchy does and blamed me, more or less, and for what I wore, for how I acted. He was disappointed in me, not angry with the next door neighbors. And that adult self is coming from it at a very different angle. So yes, the adult self now feels disappointment in my father for not protecting me, while also holding at the same time, this is a man who woke up to police officers on his front porch and was a single father, like this, and had to raise a daughter completely on his own with really no resources, no support. And he did the absolute best that he could. Was it flawed? Absolutely. Is he a member of the patriarchy? Definitely. But he loves me. And so as the adult, I hold all of that at once, that yes, he got things wrong, but he also loves me deeply and loved me deeply then. And he didn't have the answers and I didn't have the answers. And we both did the best that we could.
And that's that sort of adult, wise kind of place of compassion that I think Memoir allows us to arrive at if we stay with it, if we right into those dark places, if we ask the questions, if we're honest with ourselves. This is such a beautiful, brave, and honest book. And one of the many things that I was so moved by was, speaking of your father, he was a character I was very fond of. And even though he'd let me down in these moments that were your lived experience, but one of the things that was so profoundly impressive to me was the way you kept pushing him to know you. It wasn't just that you were calling him out and raging. You wanted him to understand, this is pain that I had. This is what I experienced. I want to be close to you.
Yeah.
And you, I sort of marvel at that. I mean, I did my best too with my father to kind of push him to see me. We want to be seen. But I feel like you did that so many times through so many conversations with him that are described in the book. And did that feel like that brought you to a closer place between the two of you?
I still don't feel seen, and he's read Rabbit Heart, and even after reading it, I don't necessarily feel seen. I don't think I can feel seen with my brother or with my father, just because I think we're very different people. They don't understand my need to write the story. They don't understand my need to put the story out there in a public way and to connect with other readers. There's so much silence on the male side of my family, and that's part of patriarchy too, right? Teaching men to be silent about these things. And yet, what a gift, really, that I did have those conversations. I did have those attempts, and I think my father understands me more than my brother does, because I've had those conversations with my father, those moments where I did go to him with different experiences. He has asked me questions about the writing, and I was always comfortable going to him with questions about my mother. Who was she? And, why didn't she breastfeed? Now, his answer was not, I think, the truth. It was a answer that, well, I don't know. Maybe she didn't breastfeed because she thought her breasts were too small. Yeah, and I thought, I don't know that would be her answer. It may be more to do with it was the 70s and they were pushing formula, and that might be a bigger factor here. But he at least, while I may not ever feel fully understood or fully seen, he was still open to my asking questions. He may not have always had the answer. He may not have always had an answer that I liked. He may not have always had the answer that was helpful or true, but he was open to the conversation. And I certainly didn't go to him with all of my pain. He had no idea everything I was going through. I was very good, I was very good at putting on a performance, and that includes for my father. And when Rabbit Heart came out and I took it to him when I had my author's copy, and I saw him hold her, I call her a her, hold her to his chest, we had a conversation about whether or not he should read it. And I said, you are going to read my pain in a way that I never showed you my pain when I was young. And I think that will be difficult for you, because I did not go to him with everything. And that's where it's not his fault either. He didn't have the tools, and he didn't have a daughter who was forthcoming about a lot of experiences. So I hope that I have written him compassionately. I worry about that. We worry about how we represent the people who matter to us. Did I get the balance right? I mean, as writers, even though the book is done, you still think about your writing and you still question it and you worry about it, especially when, particular reviewers may interpret it a certain way, particular readers may interpret it a certain way, but it helps when I hear someone like you saying, no, I was fond of the father because I'm fond of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that comes across so clearly in the way that you just capture his speech and in the way you describe the sacrifices he made as a father.
So many sacrifices.
I mean, he stayed in the family home and didn't get promotions and jobs elsewhere to keep this kind of constant place that would nurture you and your brother, and I think he also didn't remarry.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a partner for a while or a girlfriend for a while, but then he kind of closed that door. He did what he could in his own kind of language and colloquial culture to be both parents. And, that's just one paragraph in your book. But I remember when I got to that paragraph, wow, his gift and his trying to nurture you really deepened.
And there was an awareness, too, of just the impossibility. So he remembers my dance recital in third grade. So basically a year after my mother died, a year to 2 years, I started taking dance. I was not that great, but you had the dance recital. And at the dance recital, all the girls had their mothers back in the room. The makeup and the hair and the feathers and the pantyhose and extra pantyhose. And that was a traumatic experience for me because all the girls, my perception is, but my girlfriends at least, my classmates, they all had their mothers. And my father stood in the doorway of this space and remembers, he's not really supposed to be in that space. He knows that I'm hurting. He can't be there in this way. And I went home after that dance recital and I didn't eat my cake and I went to my bedroom and I cried and I never danced again in that way. And he remembers this as there is nothing I could do for you. There's nothing I could do in that moment to make it better. And it still hurts him to this day. But these gifts, so we stayed in my childhood home. He read that for adults who are undergoing trauma, it's better to make major changes, change houses, change jobs, change cities, get away from it. But for children, stability is best. So my mother's needlepoint stayed on the walls, those objects in the room deteriorating, but still my mother's objects. And I felt held by that house. I still love that house. I still go back to Oklahoma and I visit it and I take leaves off of my maple trees and, it's not my home anymore, but I still go and honor it. And that's something my father gave me, was that feeling of being held by a house that I loved and a house where I remembered my mother. Yeah.
And so he kind of created, kept intact what he could keep intact.
What he could keep intact.
And that's profound.
Yeah.
And I read it as a lot of self-sacrifice on his part.
So much
putting
sacrifice.
you and your brother first.
Yes.
In a very decisive, profound way.
Absolutely.
In the way he could. He was loving in this way to you.
Yes.
I want to sort of turn a little bit to memoir writing. We have a lot of memoir writers in the room here, people who are working on their own projects, and it connects with your father and what we're talking about, because it seems so clear to me that in the writing, and you worked on this book for 20 years, So you grew and
It's a
evolved
long journey.
many selves. I know, it feels embarrassing, doesn't it? How long did you
little
work
bit.
on this, Leslie? 17 years.
I win at 20.
Yeah, you do. You grew 3 more selves than me that wrote this book. But writing and rewriting our story and living into different parts of our lives really allows us to, come into new understandings and insights. And that's why I think your relationship with your father does come across as so loving. What was the journey of writing? How did memoir writing over such a long time change the story?
It's been such a long journey. I could spend probably 20 hours talking about just this question. I think I'll let people know where it began, where I think of its beginning, which was in middle school when I wrote my first poem, and it was about my mother's death. And I think it was born out of this need to shape and to have control over a story. A poem is lovely that way because it's distilled, you have the line breaks, you have the white space, and even though I didn't understand all of that at 13, I had my terrible rhyme scheme. It gives you something to hold on to when the content is so difficult. But I needed to get it out of my body in this way, and I needed, again, kind of gain agency over her death and over the story. And I continued that. So in my undergrad, it was poetry. In my graduate at NYU, it was poetry. And it was wonderful in poems because I could just take singular aspects of her death. When I found out about that decomposed, really means that her body was eaten by animals. When I came across that detail, I took to a poem with this nice lines and controlled the emotion that way and crafted it. And putting it on the page was brutal, but the crafting of it, the shaping of it, making those decisions about the form, about the language, about the metaphor, that's where I gained some distance. But with poetry, I was able to just take those like singular aspects, right? And that was what I needed at the time. And then for my PhD, at the time at the University of Houston, when you entered either as a poet or as a poet, you had to take a crossover workshop, which means that you had to take either a fiction workshop or nonfiction workshop. And my schedule was such that I took a nonfiction workshop with Ruben Martinez, amazing author, writer of several books about the desert, about the border. And he has a background in journalism. And he said in his classroom, you need to go to the text. And what he meant by that was research. So you take your story, but now you add in the element of research. And it starts growing the story outward, where, tentacles or ripples or however you want to think about it, it becomes not just your story, but a broader story. And that's what Memoir began to offer me, that it's not just Shepherd Mall as I know the mall, but Shepherd Mall and what it meant to Oklahoma as the first mall in the state, what it meant to other women who would not return to that mall, what it meant to people in Oklahoma after the Murrah building bombing when the state offices and federal offices were moved to the mall. Suddenly now this space isn't only about my violence, about other violences too. And that's where the growth really started happening, was when I realized this isn't only my story. This is a broader story. I had no idea, though, that Rabbit Heart was going to be so much about power and so much about patriarchy. That's what the journey has really been over the years. Started off my mother's death, my experience with grief, very particular type of grief. But through my getting into adulthood and being able to reflect back, and then rereading what I wrote and thinking, wow, there's a lot about power and gender here, that if I had finished this book 15 years ago, that would not have really been a major element because I hadn't grown into that space myself yet.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think that's what Memoir can offer us. The trick with Memoir, many tricks. One difficulty is, how do you know when it's over? Because I could keep writing this and I would have more layers as I gain more experiences. And that's, how do you know? How do you know when it's done? How do you know when this is the story and you don't need to continually add to it or think of it differently?
Right, it's never done.
Yeah.
It's never done, but you can done it. And you can feel like you've come to the close of something,
And you have to have an understanding through distance and through other readers, right? Through sharing it with some readers that you trust who can give you feedback. I think you need to arrive at an understanding of what the story is. And then once you do that, then it becomes easier to see this is when it's done. Mm-hmm. But for me, it took a long time for me to see what the story needed to be. And it was also complicated that we got a DNA match 23 years after my mother's murder. So the first draft of Rabbit Heart was my dissertation, and it didn't even have this title. And it was a collection of essays about grief, comparing the sudden loss of my mother with the slow deterioration and losing of my father. Once we got the DNA match and we went into the judicial process, that changed the entire scope. Now I have a narrative arc. There's a resolution to the case. There's a death, another character. I have more information now about her death than what I had before. And it took me a long time to figure out what she needed to be now that I had this story that I didn't come of age with. So
the story kept arriving.
It kept
changing,
arriving.
Kept pulling you along.
Yeah, it was
right?
super annoying.
Yeah, right. I'm done with this.
Yes. No, you're not. No, here's the curveball.
Right. Yeah. Many curveballs in this book. And but I'm so interested in that feminist journey for you, because when we talked on the phone, you said, I used to be, skeptical of feminism.
Yes.
And arm's length, and
definitely.
You say you're like kind of male identified, and energy for men, and that was kind of how you situated yourself. And then this book is not like that. This is a powerful book about feminist and reclamation of women's power, your mothers and yourself. Was that just kind of like you getting the story retelling itself over and over again, and you coming into your own power?
I think coming into my own power. So I recently had a conversation with my mentor from undergrad, Lisa Lewis, poet, kick-ass feminist, terrified me at 19 years old. I took her workshops, and she pushed me hard in wonderful ways, scary ways. And I remember, so the poem with the animals, for example, I turned that in her class, and I had the metaphor where truth was male. So truth exposes himself and all those dirty parts of his. And I also wrote a poem where I was longing for my own body to be abducted and raped as a way for me to finally have answers and to finally know what she experienced, so I didn't keep questioning that. But then also as a way for me to feel connected to my mother and to her body. And I remember Lisa, with these poems that I was writing, she said to me, "You are the poster child for feminism." And I thought, oh, hell no. And I imagined, I had this very clear, distinct image of a billboard. And I was on the billboard with a bunch of women. It's like, no. Because I think often young women feel this way, but it was also amplified for me because I grew up with two men. I didn't have women around me. I didn't have female, family members who were very present. And I felt very comfortable in the company of men. I'm not going to say I felt safe. Those are not the same thing. But I felt comfortable in a room full of men because I could define myself against them. I was the object. I did not hold the position of subject. I felt very comfortable in the space of being object and saying, I am not that. I am defining myself against men. And participating in that. And again, feeling comfortable because that's what I knew. So to think of me on a billboard with women, who am I supposed to be there? Who am I if I can't define myself against something else? But yes, I think it's just coming into my own power as a woman, but then also finally entering communities of women, like with you, like in Andros, friends of mine, my pseudo-mom, and just coming to embrace and be embraced by women allowed me to become more comfortable and occupy a position of subjectivity rather than being the object, and showing me that being the object is very problematic and not healthy and doesn't lead to anything that is good.
Right.
And through that, I think I was able to push into those spaces that are very uncomfortable and rabbit heart, where I feel vulnerable, where I am asking those questions. Okay, I'm 17. I'm getting into sexual relationships with my next door neighbors who are in their 30s, thinking that I had agency, thinking that I wanted that, but my body knew otherwise. My body suffered trauma, especially in some of the violent moments, and thinking that, again, that kind of being object is not, my body knew that that wasn't okay. Coming into that power then has to reckon with those experiences. And I think that reckoning with those experiences and thinking about, okay, this is how my experience with the neighbors is now connected to other forms of gendered violence, is also connected to what happened to my mother, it's also connected to my father's response over here. That's when it became the deeply feminist book, is when, again, kind of rippling outward and seeing those connections with the broader culture.
Mm-hmm. And the subjectivity, I'm a subject.
I am a subject.
What if I defined everything that's happened to me and is happening through my own experience?
Yeah.
What if I am the subject of my life, right?
Yeah.
And then all the frames change.
It does.
And Memoir is about that. What am I? What am I feeling? Who am I right now?
And the claiming of the voice, the claiming of the story. I was speaking earlier about, every now and then I'm lucky enough to teach a class that I designed that's called Breaking Silences, Memoir as an Act of Rebellion. And what I love about this class, it's primarily women who take it, not always, but the students have to break a silence of some form. And this can be a personal silence, it can be a cultural silence. They create a work of art of any medium where they are breaking a silence. And to bear witness to their subjectivity, to bear witness to their claiming their voices and their stories, sometimes for the first time, it's just magnificent. It's magical, it's empowering, it's powerful. I also take those stories home with me, so it's exhausting and, and I feel them deeply, but I think it's just truly remarkable when we finally claim our stories and say they matter. And not only do they matter to us, but then potentially they can matter to someone else if we put that story out there.
Right. They can lead to transformations with other people. And that's just brilliant. I feel like I have one more question, and then I want to open it up to questions
This
that
is
you all
so
may
scary,
have.
by the way, being the one that's answering all the questions.
You're doing great. You're doing great. This is fascinating.
I'm just looking at your mermaid earrings.
Yeah. My mermaid earrings. So it's a mother lost daughter, a motherless daughter book for me. It's a book about coming into agency, honoring complexity of your life and your mother, and coming into voice in an honoring way. This book is probably often getting compared to or put into the genre of true crime,
yes.
Right? And we've talked about that. And so, there was a wonderful essay that was out recently in Slate magazine by Lily Danziger about the difficulties of writing about murder and violence in a way that's honoring and that's in a way that's not exploitative. And did you have any awareness of true crime when you were writing this? Did you read or watch true crime? I mean, how did you keep that voice low while you were working?
I really have a non-answer when it comes to true crime, because I have not engaged much in the genre, whether it's in written form or its visual form. I did read James Ellroy's My Dark Places, a book that I detest. I think that it perpetuates violence. I think the voice on that page relishes in violence against women in a way that I just find deeply disturbing and does not move the culture forward in a way that is helpful. But I went to that memoir when I was, after my master's, starting my PhD, And I was grappling with whether or not I wanted to look at the case file in my mother's case. Because it's exhausting not having answers and imagining 1,000 different scenarios, most of which are terrible. And I thought, well, maybe if I just go through the case file and I see photographs of her body and I see the evidence, maybe I will arrive at some form of closure. And James Elroy, his mother was murdered when he was 10. And he came, he's a true crime writer, LA Confidential, this huge name. And he wrote My Dark Places about his reworking his own mother's case after he was an adult. So I went to that text not from I'm going to read true crime, but here is somebody who may have a similar experience and I want answers. And instead I ended up hurling the book across the room and launching it against the wall because I was so angry with it. And there have been a couple other memoirs, so Fact of a Body by Alex Marzano-Lesnovich, Red Parts by Maggie Nelson. Those are books that I think handle the telling of crime very, very well and ethically, where other texts do not. I don't think of Rabbit Heart as a true crime story. I think, yes, it traces the developments in the case, but only in that I am putting on the page the versions of the death that I had to reckon with growing up. So I see this as a grief memoir, a motherless daughter's memoir, a memoir that is meant to show what 25 years of unrelenting, brutal grief looks like when you are the loved one of a victim and you don't have answers. So any case details, any evidence details, they are not there for the purpose of showing a crime. They are there for the purpose of showing what it is like to constantly have a death of a loved one revised and revised again and revised again, each time getting more violent and more removed from that bunny rabbit. So, it is getting shelved in true crime, and I don't know how I feel about that. It has a broader audience. Maybe Rabbit Heart can reach that audience and get them to think about true crime in a different way and perhaps not participate in it in nearly the same way. But what I am deeply concerned about, and I've always been concerned about with this subject, is does Rabbit Heart, does my writing, especially the violence, the sexual violence, does it perpetuate the very thing that I am trying to undermine and dismantle? I think James Elroy's text perpetuates it. I don't think it dismantles gender violence. I think it participates in gender violence. And I don't know that I have an answer. I can just hope that I treated it with complexity and nuance and compassion for victims and in such a way that it is not, again, perpetuating the thing that I'm sick of, which is violence. And so much of true crime, I think, glorifies, turns it into entertainment, and I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, I don't. You failed at that.
Good.
It's a deep honoring of the complexity of losing a mother in this, radically violent way, and it's an honoring. It's an honoring of her complex life, not just the way she died, but her complex life, and it's an honoring of your journey with your family and yourself. And so, that's very clear to me. So it's beautiful and brave and honest, and I'm so...
As is yours.
And I'm so, moved to be able to talk to you about it. So can we, maybe have a time for a few questions, and then we can answer. Then we can, do some book signing.
Yeah, and I hope you can tell by my answers that I really am comfortable answering anything. I know that when it comes to this subject matter, sometimes people don't want to ask questions because it's difficult subject matter. So please, I welcome any questions that you may have. And, I haven't received a question that has sent me running before. So you could be the first, but this is such a welcoming, wonderful space that please feel comfortable. If you so wish to ask a question, I'm okay answering. I'm also hard of hearing, let me say that, so you may need to shout at me.
I have a question as a man in this room. One is, I'm in a men's group. We do a lot of men's work. I work with young men, and so I just want to apologize to any woman who has ever been hurt by men. And my big thing's about war, and it's a lot about men. And I was wondering if you, like in Insights, if you could give men some medicine, what would that be on the planet?
When I was in my PhD, talk about my journey with feminism, I had to take a postmodern theory and feminist theory course with Dr. Hogue, who is amazing. And I started reading French feminist theory. So Helen Sixou and Irigaray. And what I loved about that theory was we were examining binary oppositions and how men are defined, how women are defined, and that feminine writing is that writing that moves between and around and among and through the binaries. But one of the things that I loved about that theory was that it also examines how men lose out to the binary too. So when you define masculinity only as stoicism, only as aggression, only as being rational, right, you are not able to be your full, complex human selves. So I think the medicine is to try to get outside of those definitions and allow each and every one of us, no matter how you identify, but allow us to be fully complex human beings that occupy all definitions at some point. And that was liberating for me and informed how I wrote some of the moments or the people who are represented here. It also allows me to better understand perhaps how some of the men in my family are approaching their experiences. My father, his stance was, I am going to be stoic. I'm going to get my children through this by presenting a stability at all times. I've only seen my father cry twice over my mother. And that was wonderful for me as a child in some ways. But I think about how much was his own experience or his own journey limited by needing to present this self for his children. And I don't know if he cried on his own. I don't think he had others that he really was able to go to in significant ways. And that breaks my heart to think about what he didn't get to explore because of being defined by these definitions. And so if there is medicine, perhaps that's it, is right, breaking the binary and seeing that the binary is so deeply problematic and, again, limits all of us. Do you have an answer
that's
for
great.
this?
No, I think that's a brilliant answer. I mean, to get rid of the binaries and just have the humanity sort of open up in the full spectrum for all of us, really, is the medicine, right? Come into our humanity, our deep humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Everybody's question. Yeah.
20 years is a long time to work on a book. Were there times when you stopped and you sort of was like, I don't even know what I'm doing, and then how to come back to it and find your own flow? Like, was it stop and start? Did it feel jerky? Can you say a few words about that?
Definitely jerky. So I referenced earlier that my dissertation, again, was that collection of essays, and then with the DNA match, where I really struggled when that happened was twofold. One, I didn't yet have the distance to write that subject. So that's part of why the journey was so long, is we had this major thing happen in my mother's case. And in order for me to write it and to be able to see it clearly, I had to have distance from it in the form of time, but definitely emotions. I think there is absolute value in writing the experience in the moment, but that's different than shaping it into a work of art. So that if you write an experience in the moment, if you're feeling whatever you're feeling and you go to your journal and you write it down, you can preserve some of that original response, that emotional energy, that tension, and that will help you later on because you'll have that preserved in that way. That's different than the shaping of a story, and I needed more distance for the shaping. So it was jerky in that way. And then it was also hard because I was holding on to that previous form, trying to fit this other form into it. And luckily I had an agent who was not my agent, but she gave me some feedback, and she said, I think you have 2 books here. I don't think this is one book anymore. I think you have 2 books, a book that would be centered more on your father and that experience of his health and diminishment, and then you have the story with your mother. And once she said that, I thought, oh, God, if only somebody had told me that earlier and I could have seen it myself. But I was trying to hold too much at once. It's also jerky for me, though, because my writing process, the way that I enjoy writing, and this is why I go to Andros, is that give me 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of total immersion. I mean, 12-hour days, 14-hour days, where I am eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and I am not talking to anybody. My husband just like, stay away from me in this mode, and I am just deep in it. I have never been great at writing 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day in that way. It takes me like 45 minutes to get into the writing, so it's inefficient if I'm doing 1 hour a day, you know. I don't have that kind of time, that immersion kind of time, except during summers. And I teach at a university. I give so much of myself to my students, so much of myself to my job, my grading, all these things, and just my energy to be there and present for them, that I can't be present for my writing. So that's also why it was such a long journey, needing the distance to be able to see it, but then also having the time and the space. And I would go to Greece because that is my time to swim, be among people who inspire me, eat really good food, sometimes in this order, by the way, and then get some writing done. And so I just want to say to all of you who are writers, I mean, 20 years, it's hard to admit that when I have peers who have published 5 books during that time. I will also say, though, that I think Rabbit Heart is a stronger book because it took me so long and I was able to finally see her clearly. I would not be satisfied with my memoir if I had published it 10 years ago. So sometimes the journey is worth it if it takes you that long. Are there other questions?
I just wondered how the book has changed you. I mean, I know it took some time and you talk about some things, but I just was sort of captivated by how these things change us in unexpected ways.
Yeah. I mean, I could probably spend 10 hours with this one too, but what comes to me first, so I'll begin there, I guess, is one of the most surprising things for me with the book now existing in this form, which is different than being on the computer, you know, or different than when I print it out. I mean, I've killed so many trees, I'm so sorry, but I have to print out my drafts in order to work on them. So, you know, I have binders of, 14 drafts of this book, you know. But seeing her when she arrived at my house and I held her in my hands for the first time in this form, this concrete object, and I get very attached to objects, opening it up to the chapter Motherline, which is the chapter that's more focused on my memories of my mother. You know, that she loved Hershey Kisses, but ate Junior Mints at the movie theater. And she dressed up as the Easter Bunny and brought an Easter egg piñata to my first grade class. And she used mascara to put a Madonna mole on me and my friends when we were playing dress up. And I would brush her hair. I would sit on the small of her back. She would be on her stomach. And I would brush her hair and put my barrettes in her hair. And then she did this odd thing. She told me to scratch the dead skin from her scalp. And so I would scratch dandruff and dead skin. Like, this is odd to me now. I would never let somebody do that to my head. It's kind of gross. But I did that as a child. And I remember pressing down too hard and making her bleed accidentally. That chapter, which has more of my mother as a human being than only her death, when I opened it and I saw those words on the page, I felt this extraordinary sense of release, of accomplishment, a letting go, because I have preserved her. This book will outlast me in some form, and I have preserved a bit of my mother, not the entire woman. I will never know her, but this mother who, she had an inflatable raft for one person and called it Her Majesty's ship. I have preserved that. It's also complex though, because I've also preserved her death and I preserved her killer. So it's not, happy all the way around. But then the other aspect that I feel has changed with Rabbit Heart coming out is that I don't have to work on this story anymore. I've been writing this since the age of 13 in some form, and I assumed I would continue doing it. And yes, the grief will continue, and I imagine that my mother's death will end up in any piece of writing in some form, but I don't have to tell this story anymore. And that feels really good, and I didn't expect to feel that. So she's changed me in a lot of ways, but those were two ways that I never, ever expected.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
That's
A big
wonderful.
sigh.
That's a wonderful. Yes, question.
I'm curious about the impact your book had on your brother, how old he was when this happened.
Oh dear. This is where I don't want the camera on me in case he is watching. So my brother is 5 years older than I am, and so he was 13 at the time, and he took a different path. He had a very different journey. Both of them, certainly informed by my mother's death. So he went into the law. He went to law school. He became a prosecutor. He wanted to help other families in any way that he could, help other children in any way that he could. And then he became a judge because he didn't like the politics associated with being a prosecutor. But he does not speak nearly as openly as I do about our trauma, and is not comfortable in that space where it's been a need that I have. He has different needs. And as far as the writing goes, he went to a poetry reading of mine when I was in either graduate, it was after NYU. And I read poems about my mother's death. The animal poem was one of those, and that was a graphic poem because it was graphic information I learned. And he stared at the floor the entire time, and his face was getting redder and redder and contorted. And I was reading, and I could see that he was in pain. And afterwards, we were walking out of the space of the bookstore, and he said, "I will never do that again." And he said, "I think the same things you think, and I feel the same things you feel. The difference is I don't say it." And because so much of Rabbit Heart rehashes what we have learned about my mother's death, but then also goes into my experiences with gendered violence and sexual violence in a way that my brother was never aware of, I told him not to read Rabbit Heart. And so far, he has actually been the only person, by the way, who has in fact not read it and taken my advice. I think he read the first chapter, maybe the last chapter, but it's too painful for him. And that's okay. I honor that. And I want to protect him from that. The last thing I want is to continue to hurt somebody that I love. And it is hard as a memoirist, though. Anybody, if you are going to be writing people that you love, the most protective thing that I could have done is not write it or publish it. But ultimately, my need to claim my own story and to hopefully connect with other stories and to feel seen and to see others, that outweighs my need to protect him because he can protect himself by not reading it. Did that answer okay?
Very much so, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else?
There are a lot of deep sighs coming from you all, and
These are satisfied sighs.
I don't know what type it is, if it's like a pain.
Yeah.
Thanks for your book. It was so good. I just want to express gratitude for it, and it was difficult for me to read too, of course. I was this is about the killer of your mother, and I'm curious about your own. It's not really about the way you wrote your book. It's more just like I'm just so interested to know if you were interested to know what did you ever pursue, or were you ever curious about what like who he was and where he came from? And 'cause
Yeah.
there's not a lot of that in the book. with the
There
story.
isn't.
So I just wondered if you were just
there
like,
isn't.
that's not important to me for my.
No,
personal
it
life,"
is
or-
important. I mean, certainly the curiosity is there. I think it's a human curiosity that most of us have as far as what makes an individual do this. And my mother's killer was 21 at the time. There were two men who abducted her, but Eckhart is the one who is in prison, and we had the DNA match. He was 21 at the time. And I had always imagined a much older man killing my mother. 21, that's the age of my students. That's a kid. And so, yes, what has happened to this individual that would make him this violent? And he has a history of violence against women that's not only my mother. So that curiosity is there. And I considered everything from visiting him in prison and asking him questions, asking him why. Ultimately, though, I know that no answer he gives me as to why will be an answer that's okay, and that will make it better for me. And in fact, speaking with him could harm me and hurt me even more. I considered speaking with his sister. She testified in court. I did not include her testimony, even though it's public record. I originally had it in the memoir, and then I cut it because I felt this is not my story to tell. That's her story to tell. And if she ever wished to tell it. But I thought about I could reach out to her and ask questions. She had made comments in her testimony that their mother abused them. So I thought she might be a resource. Eckhart has children. I could potentially speak with them. But at the point that we received the plea bargain agreement and a resolution to the case, so Eckhart is in prison for the rest of his life with no appeals. 25 years, I was ready to be done. And to do that research out of my curiosity means I would get closer to the man who killed my mother. That would feel in some ways a betrayal against her. And I would continue to hurt for quite some time. And I was done by that point. And so out of protection for myself, I did not take those steps, and will let somebody else take those steps if ever they want to do the research or they want to, figure out why this specific killer or another killer or killers in general. I just couldn't do it anymore after 25 years. So it was a choice that I made because I was exhausted learning everything. And with that added layer of potentially feeling like I betrayed her by moving closer to someone that harmed her in this way. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I felt. Yeah. So felt like to honor her would be to put that boundary in place. I think you also had your hand up.
Yes, thank you for this really amazing talk with Leslie. I was curious about, so you studied writing, poetry, creative writing, and then you also, as a career, are teaching.
Yes.
And you are writing, so I wanted to know if your experience, and at what point in your life did you know that you wanted to write? And if that, if there's a connection between wanting to write and choosing your career path.
Sure. Well, that impulse was in me from the age of 13 in terms of needing to write. I use the word need rather than want because I did have the need to get this down onto a page, even when it was a terrible poem. And I've written some very terrible poems over the years. I've written some decent ones too. But that's different than, pursuing it in school, pursuing writing as a career even. I was supposed to be a rocket scientist. My math and science were always my best scores. Reading comprehension and verbal scores always my lowest. I struggle with reading. I still struggle with reading. I'm a very slow reader. I don't retain very much. But you give me a physics equation and I am happy. Give me an equal sign. to have an answer, because you don't have answers when you go into reading and writing, you know. And so my father always thought I would be a rocket scientist. I went to undergrad thinking I was going to go to medical school. I was going to be pre-med and go to medical school. I was going to go into psychiatry, psychology. I wanted to help children who had lost their parents, similar to kind of what my brother was doing. But I just kept taking these creative writing classes. And I wasn't an English major, but I just kept going to Lisa Lewis and going to poetry workshops. And it was feeding something in me that I was not getting at the subjects that I was good at. And it was feeding connection, it was feeding passion, it was feeding this way of navigating the world, of occupying the world. My father and I had this funny moment in a car where we were driving down the road, and it was concrete with black asphalt splotches, and I was young, and I said, "It's a Dalmatian," and he said, "It's a road." And I said, and we went back and forth. He does not think in metaphor. I think and experience the world in metaphor. The exception is when he brought me the bunny. He gave me the gift of metaphor. And so I just kept taking these darn classes, even though I was resisting it, because what type of career is in poetry workshop? And even my father would ask me that, like, what are you doing? And so then I went to graduate school, and I studied with amazing writers like Sharon Olds. She was my thesis advisor. Mark Doty was part of my thesis. And I was lucky enough at NYU, my last semester there, that they gave me a creative writing class to teach. And they did not prep me. I had no pedagogy classes. I had no training. They just said, here's your class. I'm 24 years old in a class with 20-year-olds. I have no freaking clue what I'm doing. I had 12 students, and I just mimicked what I saw my professors doing, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love being in the classroom with my students, helping them with their voices. I don't always get it right, but those moments of connections, moments of having coffee with a student and talking about their work, pushing them to see something they didn't see originally, everything that my professors have offered me. I mean, just last week I had conferences with students, 3-hour conferences for one student, because I was so into it. I was so into discussing their writing with them. What's problematic is that the way that I teach, giving 3 hours of my time for one student, is not always aligned with what my creative needs are. And finding that balance, I've been okay with the balance that I've had, but now I'm longing for more of my creative life. I'm longing to occupy my poet self, my memoir self, that sensibility. I'm wanting to connect with other writers who are parts of my community and not spend as much time and energy with my students as I have. So I need to, we were talking, this word is in my head now, but recalibrate. I need to recalibrate my balance in terms of my teaching and my creative work. But they can feed each other. They can take away from each other, absolutely. But in the best of ways, when I have a class like Breaking Silences, and I see my students breaking their silences, sometimes for the first time, coming into their voices, coming into their power, shaping a story, that then inspires me when I am feeling vulnerable about putting this in the world. And I think maybe I can do it because they're trusting me with their stories, and I'll trust somebody else with mine. So that's when it's at its best, is when they're feeding each other. And my students, I can give them, like I assigned Leslie's book. I didn't get to teach it because I had to take a leave. So the students read it. But even a text that I've read 15 years, I'll go into the classroom and the students will bring me something new. They'll make me see a text in a new way because they're individuals and they're bringing their own interpretations and experiences. And what a gift to constantly be learning. And then that then helps the creative life. So it's a difficult balance for me, but it's one, again, when it works well, it works well. Did that answer okay?
Sounds like multiple equal signs.
There you go.
What was
There
that
you
what you
go.
say?
Multiple equal signs.
Yeah.
I like that. Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you. I'm grateful for your book. I've read it, and I didn't really know what to expect. And then the whole theme of feminism struck me so much, and sometimes how you write and it's in the personal, but then it can go, it's universal, and that's what it was for me, and it brought up experiences that I had when I was younger, and it was in a very different perspective that I was seeing those, and so thank you for taking 20 years to write it. It all came out. It's just, it gives me hope.
Thank you. Yeah, it's there wasn't a question in there, was there?
No.
Okay. With my hearing, I was speaking about this a little bit earlier, that when I grew up with two men, my brother and my father, and so much silence, especially about my own insecurities, my own experiences, I felt so isolated. I felt isolated from them, certainly, but I just felt like abnormal, and if I'm struggling with a tampon, I am the only one in the world who's ever struggled with a tampon, especially when the instructions say how easy it is. I'm struggling to understand what this experience is. I'm struggling over here, and I just felt so alone in it. And one of the things that teaching has also offered me is that because my students are telling their stories, especially my female students, my non-binary students, it made me realize I am not alone. I made the murdered mother a little bit more unique, yes, but those experiences with our bodies, those experiences within patriarchy, those experiences with shame, those experiences with power, I am definitely not alone in that. And my students showed me that, and I'm so grateful because, again, that gives me a bit of hope that if I now share Rabbit Heart, that maybe I can have this moment with you, to say, we see each other in this way, and maybe that's how we can move forward. So thank you in return for what you just offered.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to cry.
Oh, well. That's part of the journey too, right?
Yes, it is.
The tears.
Yeah.
The tears. Yeah. Shall we maybe
Have fun.
transition? Yeah.
I was just struck, you were both so articulate.
Yeah.
Both of you.
Yeah.
This has just been such a dreamy afternoon. Thank you so
It has.
much for coming